Good morning. I hope that everyone is well. It is great to be talking to you today. I am Nina Lonchar, Senior Client Operations Executive at Comscore Movies. Today I'm going to be talking to you about UK and Ireland box office and audience trends. I will start by giving you a brief overview on what we do. Comscore Movies is the global standard for box office reporting. We collect box office data worldwide, covering more than 60 territories, and we have been part of the movie industry for nearly 30 years. It is actually our 30th anniversary next year. I thought we would start by looking at the last decade trends across UK and Ireland. What we can see here in blue is the gross box office year on year, as well as the top highest grossing titles for each year on top. If we look at earlier years, we can see that we have already crossed a £1 billion milestone. This was first achieved in 2009, actually, with moving on to 2012, setting a new box office record where Skyfall became the first film ever in UK and Ireland to cross the £100 million mark. Since then, only one other title has achieved this, as we can see on here in 2015, the long-awaited Star Wars The Force Awakens, with over £123 million. 2015 is another notable record-breaking year, first to cross 1.3 billion. Since then, the total cinema box office in the UK and Ireland has exceeded 1.3 billion for 5 consecutive years, with highest point being reached in 2017, as we can also see here. So on this slide, all I really wanted to show was, as you saw in the BFI session yesterday, that as well as the rise in the box office, the content, the volume of content has been increasing over the last few years, as we can see in this red line. And we've reached an all-time high in 2018 with 924 releases. On this slide, we can see the start of 2020 compared to the equivalent period in 2019. And as you can tell, 2020 was looking very promising. It started with a very strong performance in the first weeks of the year, being 20% ahead by the end of February. If we take a look at the top 5 films of the year, the key thing to note here is that 4 out of 5 titles have actually been released in Q1. So 1917, Sonic the Hedgehog, Bad Boys for Life, and Dolittle, with only Tenet being released outside of this period. So as already mentioned on the previous slide, we had a very strong start of the year, which sadly, as we all know, was followed by 16 weeks of closures. On this slide, we're looking at the weeks when cinema started to reopen. We can see 2020 box office in red. It started to re-emerge slowly. It mainly picks up from week 27. It was a very staggered reopening. In this period, we can see the best week we had was the week 35 at the end of August, when Tenet was released. When Tenet opened, it reached almost 60% of the regular week's box office, which was as close as we got to last year. Tenet carried on strongly, remaining at number 1 for 8 consecutive weeks. However, as we know, it wasn't followed by any other major Hollywood films. We did have few other arrivals, but the new content was very sparse. And sadly, again, at the end of October, we see drop-off as we had further lockdowns across various regions. So as we've seen, nationally, we're down about 74%. And when we actually look at the individual regions, we're not seeing a lot of difference, considering we had staggered reopenings. Only with Wales, we're seeing a bit of a bigger drop. This is possibly due to being the last region to reopen on 27th of July. Moving on. So on this slide, we can look at the box office performance across different size venues, from smaller single screen venues to multiplexes. So we have two tables here. On the first one, we're looking at the year to date so far. And on the second one, we're only looking at the post-lockdown period, 3rd of July to 5th of November. We noticed that sites with 6+ screen have suffered the largest drops, only achieving 26% of the previous year's box office when looking at the year as a whole, and 11% of the post-lockdown period. We can see percentage achieved in comparison to 2019 starts to rise as the size of the venue descends, with the single screen sites performing the best and achieving 34% of year-to-date box office versus 2019 and 18% when comparing to post-lockdown period. There is a bit more on this on the next slide. So when looking at the titles that have performed well across different venues, we are seeing different content, but also some similarities, like Tenet, for example, was at #1 across all sites. As we can see, smaller venues have been more art house, their community sites attracting older event cinema audiences. For example, we can see the best performing titles are Dirty Dancing, Greatest Showman, Michael Ball and Alfie Boe Concert. This goes some way to explaining why single screen cinemas have fared better. There are still some similarities across titles that have performed at single screens, 2 to 3 screens and 4 to 5 screens, like On the Rocks, Secret Garden, while sites with 6+ screens are mainly dominated in mainstream titles, which there was, as we know, lack of, hence the largest drops we saw on the previous slide. We looked at the same data for 2019, and there was a lot less difference, actually, in the type of titles when compared to 2020. On this slide, we're looking at the theatres that have reopened post-lockdown, again, based on the size of the site. What is very interesting when comparing to the previous slide, so small venues, as we saw, have performed relatively well year on year, despite the fact that only half of them have reopened. So to go over what I previously mentioned, they have achieved 34% of 2019 box office year to date, with only half the cinemas open in that group, which is quite impressive, really. So here we're looking at the drive-in cinemas. So bridging the gap during the gradual reopening, we had an arrival of drive-in cinemas, which they were offering a safe way to audience to watch the films back at the big screens. Over the summer period, we've seen 31 drive-in sites open and contribute over 1.6 million to the overall gross for the year. Another interesting point to make here, if we look at the right-hand side, it's not only classical titles that have performed well that you would expect to see at the drive-in sites. We're seeing a real variation in the best performing titles. We have Tenet, 1917, Bad Boys for Life. It certainly attracted a wide range of audience. Next slide. So as well as the long-awaited release of Tenet, which we've already touched upon, audiences had quite a bit of other choices as well. Available content was attracting audiences across varied genres, as we can see here. So we can see action blockbuster titles, as well as teen and family genre. They have actually performed the best and proved the most popular. As well as looking at box office performance at Comscore, we also provide exit polls for about 130 films a year, mostly all saturation releases. Our post-track survey covers audience profile, motivation, response to the film, and future intent. Looking at audience profile for titles before lockdown, which is shown in blue, and post-lockdown shown in red, we can see that younger audience was more reassured to return back to the cinema, especially age group 18 to 24 and 25 to 34. It does appear that the older audience was a bit more reluctant to return. So if we look a bit deeper at a specific title, on here we can see audience breakdown for Tenet Comp report against all film average, which is shown on the first line. This is the age profile for all titles we have tracked in post-track, and comparison titles below, which are confirmed by the distributor. One thing to note here, Tenet and Inception were both tracked post-lockdown, and we can see that both titles have a considerably higher younger audience percentage in the 18 to 24 age group, which is shown in red, and 25 to 34 age group shown in orange, compared to all films in the first line, and again, all the comp reports, comp titles below. While older age groups, 35 to 44 and 45 to 54, which are shown in the blue shades, are considerably higher for titles that were tracked before lockdown. For example, if you look at Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and Mission Impossible Fallout at the bottom, they're quite a bit higher. So we have also, in post-track, we have added 2 COVID-related questions once fieldwork was resumed. In this question, we're trying to see what motivated UK audience to return at the cinema. As we can see, 3 leading answers here are a new film they wanted to see, and as well as the social aspect, doing an activity with friends and family, and desire to get back to normal life. Social distancing measures and cleanliness were also important, while if you look at the bottom, 14% of the audience said they didn't actually have any concerns about returning, which is very good. As well as in the UK, we conduct post-track across other international markets. So on this slide, we're looking at the same question and what motivated the audience to return to the cinema across 4 different territories. So we're looking at UK, Germany, Mexico, and US. And we are actually seeing varied reasons across these territories. So while UK, as we've already seen, was driven mainly by film lovers, social aspect was the main driver for audiences in Germany and US, as we can see on the second table. Audiences in Mexico appear to be the least interested in the new content. We can see only 13%. For them, it was more important reassurance, they were safe to return, as well as social aspect, similar to Germany and US. So again, moving on to second COVID question, looking at all 4 countries. Again, on this slide, we have compared audience reactions to see how likely they are to return to the cinema following their first visit. The response to this question was very positive. We're seeing very similar responses in all 4 countries, with more than 95% of the audience saying they would return to the cinema, which is shown in blue and red, which is a very likely and quite likely response. And finally, looking ahead to 2021. So with many titles postponed from 2020, it will definitely be quite a busy year ahead of us. Looking what we have on the calendar so far, first few weeks of the new year do appear to be a bit slower. However, on the top half of the slide, we can see quite a few titles that are currently scheduled to be released in the first half of the year. So we have Peter Rabbit 2, followed by the much anticipated 25th James Bond installment, No Time to Die, which, if we look at the previous Bond titles, Skyfall achieved over 100 million. Spectre also was very close with 95 million. It is probably expected to be the highest grossing release of 2021. So there are many other titles in the first half of the year. We have Quiet Place 2, Black Widow, Fast and Furious 9. Also many more releases in the second half of the year too. We have Top Gun, Minions, Dune, West Side Story, just to name a few. The recovery will be driven by many of the well-known and loved franchises, as well as some new content. So there is definitely a lot to look forward to in 2021. I just want to say thank you on behalf of Comscore for your time today. If you do have any questions, my email address is on the slide. Thank you very much again for your time. Stay safe and best wishes for the rest of the year.